So, state model example. So, Bob mentioned the Minnesota E21 process. Again, that was the stakeholder-driven process where they said, is our grid going to do for us what we needed to do for the coming century? They were 2 years on both principles. Any good policy will have to do X, will have to do these things. So they went through that process, and then they identified some issues that were really important to them. One of them was performance-based regulation, which we talked about a lot. The statute then changed to allow utilities who filed multi-year rate plans. So instead of the normal practice there was the utility would come in when they wanted to have a look at their rates, or the commission could instigate something, which rarely happened. Instead of that, the utility and Xcel Energy took them up on this and actually filed a multi-year rate plan. So a 4-year rate plan, the commission has the ability to look at what they're going to expend over that period of time, what they're going to do in terms of grid management during that particular time, and then they have an expectation of what the rates are going to do as well. Part of that was performance-based regulation. So the commission then set out on a process using stakeholders, and stakeholders, I use that term a lot, but it's kind of like anybody who's really interested in these subjects, not just the people who intervene at the commission, but guys like Ryan, so guys who are really interested in the subject will come in and be part of the stakeholder group. So Minnesota had a series of goals. So they said, if we're going to do performance-based regulation, we're going to protect the environment, we're going to have adequate, efficient, and reasonable service, so the whole reliability issue we've been talking about, reasonable rates and opportunity for fair return. It wasn't something that was going to be a gotcha to the utilities. They're going to try to devise a performance-based system that was going to work with the utilities so that the utilities could see value in doing things a little bit differently than just the traditional way of doing it. And now they've been measuring first, and I'll get to their process, because I think it's one that I'm starting to see pop up in a lot of places. I'm starting to see the Minnesota process. I saw it in Illinois. I'm seeing it in Washington. People are starting to look at that as a way to address these particular issues. So they're in the measurement and reporting phases right now. The desired outcomes then were affordability, reliability, customer service quality, which we talked about, environmental performance, including beneficial electrification, so changing over to EVs, we're looking at changing over to electricity in buildings, and then the one that we've been talking about with either time-varying rates or demand response and critical peak pricing, that's what that last one is designed to get at, the cost-effective alignment of generation and load, including demand response. So are we doing what we can to actually match up, when we have the cleanest, cheapest power available to where the load is coming, where people are trying to draw on the power system. So any of the metrics that they designed had to fit into one of those buckets. The Attorney General's office, we go to the next slide, in Minnesota came up with, and they had I should have the actual slide they had each of these in a box in a circle that we affectionately call it the circle of life, for performance metrics. But obviously goals, outcomes, those are things we just talked about. Then figuring out what we measure already, identifying what would be the best way to try to get at and understand if we're meeting those goals and objectives, and then establish, okay, this is where we're at right now. Here's where we'd like you to go. Here's where we would like to see you actually get in terms of the metric and the targets that are there. And then kind of rinse and repeat. Always be evaluating that, because what you do for the system now may not be the same 5 years from now. Likely won't be. You're going to be looking at different things. You're going to be able to measure differently, maybe measure better. And so the whole idea, though, was to have a system set up where you were constantly reviewing the performance metrics that were out there to make sure that you were incenting on the utility's behalf the behavior that you wanted them to have, the goals that you wanted them to reach. So we go to the next slide, and Minnesota's well into that process. But the next slide, so Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEIA, in Illinois. That was legislation I referred to a moment ago. Aside from setting dates to close their coal plants, and aside from setting dates to close the gas plants in the state, and aside from doing a whole lot more on energy efficiency and a whole lot of spending on renewable energy, making some changes to the transmission system, in addition to all that, they decided to rewrite the rate design for how utilities get compensated in Illinois. They didn't have enough to do, which is part of the reason why the bill's like 950 pages long, too. So one of the things that they really wanted to do was get rid of what they had called a formula rate that came in 2011 in the Energy Infrastructure Modernization Act. So to get to the point that was asked earlier in the question, grid hardening, making sure that the grid can actually handle all of the power that's coming through that. Putting on advanced meters so that we had a better understanding of when people were using power on the system. All of that was done in this act in 2011, but at the same time, they also changed it. So instead of the commission actually looking every year and saying, well, this is for the utility to make their, to have a reasonable return, this is the percentage that they're going to get paid on top of the physical plant that they've got. They took that away from the commission, and there was a rate that was just set by a number of basis points above whatever the Treasury bill index was at that point. So if utility A could borrow money at 1% and utility B couldn't borrow money except at 10%, they were both treated the same, which as a former regulator doesn't make any sense to me because you're trying to decide what they actually need to make their profit margin. So it took away a really vital part of the commission. And in addition to that, it didn't give the commissioners the ability to kind of look behind the curtain and see where the money was being spent on this grid. And so what you ended up having, and I'm not making a comment about whether all of this was well spent or not well spent or anything like that, but what you ended up seeing was that the distribution costs in Illinois went up dramatically during that 10-year period, because I think a combination of the commissioners couldn't look at the extra spend, and they got lucky that the rate of inflation was so low that the Treasury bills were so low. They got lucky there, but still, the amount that Illinois customers spent on distribution was much higher. So people wanted to get rid of that, and so they did. And so what they did is they gave utilities a choice of going back to the system before the formula rates, or doing what Minnesota did and allowing the ability for a multi-rate plan. But while they were doing that, they did a grid, they ordered a grid audit. There's now integrated distribution planning in the state, as well as multi-year rate plan, a lot more documents that have to get filed so that not just the commissioners, but also the public can understand where this money is being spent on the grid and come to some conclusions that they might have about whether the money is being spent wisely or not. And so, in addition to that, they've got performance-based regulation now that's part of that.